The experiment begins. The laboratory was silent. Too silent. Kz'Rath could hear only the low hum of the containment field and the steady rhythm of his own twin hearts. He adjusted the neural interface on his smooth violet-hued forehead, his elongated fingers trembling slightly. Not from fear, of course. His species, the Vulek, were beyond such primitive emotions. He told himself it was merely anticipation. Today, he would do something no Vulek had ever done. He would read a human mind. The subject sat across from him, separated by a transparent energy field. It was an ordinary human male, barely past his third decade of life. Unremarkable. His species had only recently entered the galactic stage, and yet their reputation had spread like wildfire. Unpredictable, illogical, primitive, dangerous. But Kz'Rath didn't believe in myths. He was one of the most powerful telepaths in the Vulek Dominion, and he had read the minds of over 100 different species. Warriors, politicians, criminals, geniuses. Every mind was just patterns, like a song playing in a loop. Once you understood the melody, it was easy to decipher. Humans would be no different. Are you ready? The voice of Overseer Kz'Rath crackled through the intercom. Kz'Rath exhaled. I am. The human, his name was Daniel, smirked. His heartbeat was steady, his posture relaxed. Strange. Most test subjects showed at least some sign of anxiety. All right, Mr. Alien, Daniel said, his voice casual. Go ahead. Read my mind. Kz'Rath ignored the arrogance in his tone. He placed his fingertips against the interface, closed his eyes, and extended his consciousness outward. Connection established. For a brief moment, everything was normal. He saw flashes of memories, childhood, school, laughter, sadness. He moved deeper, peeling through layers of thoughts like flipping through a book. A primitive mind, just as expected. Then, something shifted. The connection snapped out of his control, like a fishhook lodged deep into his own brain. Kz'Rath gasped. He tried to pull back, to break the link, but he was stuck. A storm erupted inside his mind. Images, sensations, voices, so many voices. It wasn't just Daniel. It was something bigger. Wars, screams, laughter, music, blood, hope, despair. Thousands, no, millions, of thoughts slammed into him at once. The weight of human history, of untamed emotion, of something ancient and chaotic surged through him like wildfire. He saw battles fought over love, kings betrayed by friends, a child crying over a lost pet, a soldier sacrificing himself for strangers, a dictator burning cities to the ground, a mother whispering to her newborn, a scientist discovering the secrets of the universe. Too much. It was too much. His mind fractured. Kz'Rath screamed. Overseer Kz'Rath's voice was shouting something through the intercom, but he couldn't hear it. His body convulsed, his nerves burning as if molten metal had been poured into his skull. Blood dripped from his nose. Get out. Get out. Get out. With the last shred of his will, he severed the connection. The lab exploded into chaos. The energy field flickered, alarms blared. Medical personnel rushed toward him. Kz'Rath collapsed onto the cold metallic floor, his body twitching violently. His vision blurred, but through the haze, he saw Daniel still sitting calmly in his chair, smiling. The last thing Kz'Rath heard before unconsciousness swallowed him was the human's voice. Told you. You shouldn't have looked. Darkness consumed him. Waking up in the hospital. Pain. Kz'Rath had never known pain like this. His mind throbbed like it had been torn apart and stitched back together wrong. His twin hearts pounded in a frantic, uneven rhythm. His limbs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. The sterile scent of medical disinfectant filled his nostrils, sharp and suffocating. Where am I? He forced his eyes open. Dim white lights flickered overhead. Strange, distorted voices echoed around him, muffled as if he were underwater. The walls were sleek, metallic, a medical bay. His vision swam, but he recognized the symbols glowing on the nearby control panels. High-security containment unit. They had locked him up. A sudden spike of fear coursed through him. Raw, primal. Kz'Rath clenched his jaw. That emotion didn't belong to him. The Vulek were an advanced species, beyond such base instincts. And yet, the fear didn't fade. He tried to sit up. Pain flared through his skull, sending sharp daggers of white-hot agony behind his eyes. He groaned and fell back against the medical cot. A soft, rhythmic beeping filled the room, his vitals being monitored. Then, a voice. "You're awake." Kz'Rath turned his head slowly. A fellow Vulek stood at the foot of the cot, dressed in a formal medical uniform. High Physician Kz'Rath. Kz'Rath had known him for years, had trained with him, respected him. But now, something was wrong. Kz'Rath's usual calm expression was gone, replaced by something alien to their kind. Worry. His lavender skin was paler than normal, his dark eyes filled with unease. Kz'Rath tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his voice a ragged whisper. How long? 3 standard cycles. 3 days. Kz'Rath's breath hitched. He had never lost consciousness for that long in his entire life. Kz'Rath stepped closer, scanning a medical tablet. Your neural activity was completely erratic when they brought you in. Spikes of electrical surges across every region of your brain. We had to place you in a stasis field to stabilize you. Kz'Rath swallowed, trying to moisten his throat. The human. Kz'Rath's expression darkened. Gone. Kz'Rath blinked. What? The subject disappeared shortly after the incident. Security footage shows him walking out of the facility as if nothing happened. No signs of injury. No distress. Just left. Impossible. Kz'Rath had seen humans before. Fragile, weak, emotional creatures. The neural backlash alone should have caused the human some kind of damage. And yet he had simply walked away. It didn't make sense. I need to see the recordings, Kz'Rath said, pushing himself upright. Kz'Rath hesitated, but then tapped a command into his tablet. A holographic screen flickered to life above them. The lab. The containment field. Kz'Rath's body convulsing, alarms blaring, medics rushing in. And then the human. He was sitting there, completely unharmed, watching, smiling. Even as Kz'Rath's body collapsed, even as the lab descended into chaos, the human didn't move. He just tilted his head slightly, as if amused. Then, without a word, he stood up, walked toward the exit. The security doors opened for him. Kz'Rath's mind recoiled. That's not possible. The facility was one of the most secure in the Dominion. No subject, especially not a human, should have been able to leave without clearance. The doors required a biological keycard linked to specific personnel. And yet, he had walked out like he belonged there. Kz'Rath shuddered. His head ached with a dull, pulsing throb. His thoughts were a tangled mess, fragments of human emotion, lingering like whispers in the back of his mind. War, death, love, chaos. Kz'Rath clutched his head. What did I see? Kz'Rath studied him carefully. That's what we need to find out. Kz'Rath gritted his teeth. He was a trained telepath, one of the best in the Dominion. No mind had ever resisted him before. And yet this human had nearly destroyed him. The worst part. Somewhere, deep inside, a voice whispered, "You're still in his mind." The madness of a human mind. Kz'Rath stared at the holographic screen long after the footage ended. The human had walked out. No signs of distress. No confusion. No weakness. Just control. That should have been impossible. No telepathic subject walks away from a mind invasion unscathed. The backlash alone should have scrambled his thoughts, induced trauma, or at the very least, left him dazed. But he had smiled. Why had he smiled? A cold shudder rippled through Kz'Rath's body. He felt wrong. Something was inside his mind. He rubbed his temples, trying to focus, but the more he reached inward, the more his thoughts twisted and blurred. Images that didn't belong to him flashed before his eyes. Flashes of war. Fire raining from the sky. Bombs melting cities into glass. Soldiers screaming as bullets tore through them. Laughter. Children running through fields, their faces lit with joy. A man proposing to a woman under a bright, golden sunset. A scientist crying as they made a breakthrough that would change history. The emotions crashed over him like tidal waves. Grief, rage, hope, love, despair, euphoria. Too much, too much. Kz'Rath gasped and slammed his fists against the medical cot. Lurvax jolted. Kz'Rath. He didn't respond. His vision blurred, the walls around him warping. The sterile white of the medical bay twisted into something else, a battlefield. The floor beneath him was no longer cold metal but scorched earth, covered in blood and broken bodies. Explosions thundered in the distance. The scent of smoke and death filled his nostrils. Kz'Rath wasn't in the medical bay anymore. He was in a human memory. No, not a memory. Something deeper. He turned, and there they were, humans. Thousands of them, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in agony, reaching for him. "Get out." A voice whispered behind him. Kz'Rath spun around. A shadow stood in the distance, barely visible through the smoke. A human figure, featureless and unmoving. "Get out," it said again. Then it rushed at him. Kz'Rath screamed. He crashed back into reality, gasping, his body drenched in sweat. The beeping of the medical monitors spiked wildly. His limbs trembled as if he had just run through a storm. Lurvax gripped his shoulders. "What's happening to you?" Kz'Rath shook his head violently. "The human. I never left." Lurvax's expression darkened. "What do you mean?" Kz'Rath pressed his hands against his skull. His thoughts were unraveling. "I didn't just read his mind," he whispered. "I touched something bigger." Lurvax frowned. "You're not making sense." "No." Kz'Rath's breathing was ragged, his eyes wide with horror. "You don't understand. The human mind. It's not like ours. It's not a collection of thoughts, emotions, or memories. It's something else. Something alive." Lurvax studied him carefully. "You are experiencing severe neural trauma. We need to stabilize." "You don't get it." Kz'Rath snarled. "I can still hear them." Lurvax's hands froze. "Hear? Who?" Kz'Rath's fingers dug into the sides of his head. His voice dropped to a whisper. "All of them." Lurvax took a slow step back. "That's not possible." Kz'Rath looked up, his eyes wide, unblinking. "Do you know what I saw? Do you even begin to understand what's inside a human mind?" His voice cracked, barely holding back hysteria. Lurvax said nothing. Kz'Rath let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "Neither did I." He closed his eyes. For centuries, the Vulek believed telepathy was the ultimate power. The ability to control, to read, to dominate lesser minds. But humans, their minds could not be controlled. Because their minds weren't just singular thoughts, patterns, or emotions. They were chaos, a storm of history, a war of ideas, a contradiction of dreams and nightmares. And Kz'Rath had walked straight into it. And now he wasn't sure he could walk back out. The voices won't stop. Kz'Rath did not sleep that night. He tried. The medical bay was quiet, the dim lights humming softly overhead. The bed was comfortable, the temperature adjusted to his physiology. But his mind was not his own anymore. The moment he closed his eyes, they came. The voices. Whispers crawled into his ears, foreign yet familiar. Some were soft, like lovers sharing secrets in the dark. Others were sharp, frantic, screaming words he couldn't understand. They spoke over each other, merging into a chaotic symphony of madness. He could hear laughing. He could hear weeping. He could hear war. Flashes of memories that weren't his flickered behind his eyelids. Explosions, roaring flames, the clash of metal against metal, the hollow silence of space after a battle. Then, something peaceful. A child sitting under a tree, flipping through a book. An old man gazing at the stars with tired eyes, muttering to himself. Kz'Rath's hands clenched into fists. This isn't real. These aren't mine. He forced himself upright, his twin hearts hammering against his ribs. He needed control. He was a Vulek, a telepath of the highest order. He had broken into the minds of galactic warlords, criminal masterminds, entire planetary leaders. So why? Why was he struggling to silence one human? His breathing grew ragged. He pressed his hands against his temples, willing the voices to stop. And then, one voice stood out from the rest. A whisper. Low, amused. Are you still in here with me? Kz'Rath froze. His blood turned to ice. That voice. Daniel. He spun around, expecting to see the human standing in the room. But he was alone. Just the sterile walls of the medical bay, the soft glow of the monitors. His pulse pounded in his skull. This isn't real. He's gone. And yet, the voice came again, teasing, amused. I told you, Kz'Rath, you shouldn't have looked. A chill ran down his spine. His name. The human knew his name. How? How? Kz'Rath lurched off the bed, stumbling toward the control panel. His fingers trembled as he activated the terminal. Find him. He needed to find the human. He needed to know what had happened to him. The screen flickered. Security records. Personnel logs. The last known movements of subject Daniel. There. The final recording of the human before he disappeared. Kz'Rath hit play. The footage was grainy but clear. Daniel stood in front of the security doors, hands in his pockets, relaxed. 2 guards blocked the exit, their weapons trained on him. They were speaking, but there was no sound in the recording. Then, something changed. The guards suddenly froze. Their bodies stiffened, their expressions going blank. Daniel tilted his head, watching them for a moment. Then, without a word, he walked forward. The guards stepped aside. The doors opened, and the human simply walked away. Kz'Rath's breath caught in his throat. The guards didn't move until Daniel was completely gone. Then, as if waking from a trance, they looked around in confusion, weapons still in their hands. They had no memory of what had just happened. Kz'Rath gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. This was impossible. Humans had no recorded telepathic abilities. Their species had never demonstrated any form of psychic control, mental manipulation, or anything even remotely close to what he had just witnessed. And yet, Daniel had walked out. No alarms, no resistance. The security system let him go. Kz'Rath's breathing quickened. His mind reeled. His memories of the experiment twisted in his head, replaying the moment he had connected with the human. It was supposed to be a simple mind-reading session. One-way access. He was the invader, the observer. But what if he had been wrong? What if in that moment, when he had entered Daniel's mind, Daniel had entered his? A sharp pain lanced through his skull. The voice returned. Soft, mocking. Right inside his mind. Took you long enough to figure it out. Kz'Rath screamed. He staggered backward, his vision blurring. His body wasn't listening to him anymore. His own hands trembled, his own heartbeat raced, but it felt wrong. Like he was a passenger inside himself. Something was in his head. No, someone. Daniel's chuckle echoed through his skull. I wonder how long you'll last. Darkness clawed at the edges of Kz'Rath's vision. His body collapsed, the sound of the medical alarms blaring in the distance. As he fell, he realized something terrifying. He had invaded a human mind. And now, the human mind was invading him. Trapped inside my own mind. Kz'Rath was drowning. Not in water. Not in space. inside himself. The moment he collapsed, his body went cold. The medical bay vanished. The alarms faded. The world around him peeled away like smoke in the wind, replaced by something else. Darkness. An endless, suffocating void. No stars. No ground beneath his feet. Just infinite black stretching in all directions. He floated, weightless, untethered. And then, the whispers returned. Soft at first, a gentle murmur just beyond the edge of hearing. Then louder. 1,000 voices. 1,000,000. Crying, laughing, screaming. Memories crashed into him in violent waves. Not his own. Human memories. A soldier in the trenches, feeling the vibration of distant artillery before the blast reached him. A scientist staring at an empty equation, knowing they were moments away from solving it, or going insane trying. A mother holding her newborn, whispering its name for the first time. A dying man on a battlefield, staring up at the sky, wondering if anyone would remember his name. Kz'Rath thrashed against the flood of thoughts, his thoughts, but they weren't his. He was being swallowed whole by something massive, something beyond comprehension. He tried to scream, but his voice was gone. Then, footsteps. Soft, slow, purposeful. Kz'Rath turned. There, standing in the darkness, was Daniel. The human was calm, relaxed, hands in his pockets. He wasn't floating like Kz'Rath. He stood on solid ground that didn't exist. He smiled. "Welcome," he said. "Took you long enough to realize." Kz'Rath tried to move toward him, but his body didn't respond. His form felt disconnected, like his limbs weren't fully his anymore. Panic flared through him. What is this?" he demanded. Daniel tilted his head. "You're inside your own mind. Or maybe, you're inside mine. Hard to tell at this point." Kz'Rath's stomach dropped. No, that was impossible. He had been the one to enter Daniel's mind. He had been the one in control. Hadn't he? Daniel took a step closer, his gaze sharp. "Tell me, Kz'Rath, you and your kind think you're the masters of the mind, don't you? Peering into the thoughts of others like flipping through the pages of a book. Reading. Controlling. Owning." Kz'Rath said nothing. Daniel's smile faded. "But did you ever stop to wonder what would happen if you tried to read something too big?" The whispers grew louder. The voices pressed against Kz'Rath's mind, drowning him in a storm of thoughts and emotions. Daniel kept walking toward him. "You thought my mind would be easy to read. You thought humans were simple." He chuckled. "You thought wrong." Kz'Rath struggled against the force pulling him deeper into the void. "This isn't possible. No species has a mind like this. No one can." Daniel cut him off with a whisper. "We do." The darkness around them shifted. The void rippled, and suddenly, Kz'Rath saw them. Thousands, millions, shadows of humans, standing silently in the blackness, their eyes glowing like dying stars. Not individuals. A storm of consciousness. Kz'Rath's twin hearts stopped. He understood now. The human mind wasn't a single entity. It wasn't something that could be read, controlled, or broken. It was a battlefield, a never-ending war of thoughts, ideas, and contradictions. One voice could not exist alone. One thought did not live in isolation. To enter a human mind was to enter all of them. Daniel stopped inches from him. His eyes, asterisk, those cursed human eyes, asterisk, burned with something that Kz'Rath had never seen before. Something terrifying. Something alien. "You thought you were looking into me," Daniel said softly. "But really, I was looking into you." Kz'Rath felt his body fracturing. His own memories, his own identity, were breaking apart like brittle glass. He wasn't just hearing human thoughts anymore. He was becoming a part of them. Becoming human. "No," he snarled. He fought against the pull, forcing himself backward, willing his mind to shut out the voices. He was Vulek, a master telepath. He would not be consumed. Daniel watched him struggle, his expression unreadable. Then he raised a single finger and tapped Kz'Rath's forehead. Everything collapsed. The darkness shattered. The voices screamed. And Kz'Rath was ripped back into reality. He woke up screaming. Lervax and 2 other physicians rushed toward him, their eyes wide with alarm. "Contain him," someone shouted. Hands gripped Kz'Rath's arms, holding him down as he thrashed. He barely registered their presence. His mind was still burning. His head pulsed with thoughts that weren't his. The memories, the voices, they were still there. Lervax leaned over him, concern etched into his face. "Kz'Rath, listen to me. You're safe. You're back." Kz'Rath gasped for breath, staring at his own trembling hands, his own body, his own reflection in the metallic walls of the medical bay. But he felt wrong. His thoughts weren't his alone anymore. Daniel had left something behind. Something that whispered at the edge of his consciousness. A single word. Run. Kz'Rath's blood turned to ice. What had he let into his mind? I am not alone. Kz'Rath's breathing was shallow, ragged. His twin hearts pounded against his ribcage as he stared at his own reflection in the metallic walls of the medical bay. His own face. His own body. But inside, something was different. The voices had faded, but the presence remained. A shadow at the edges of his mind. A whisper that wasn't his own. Daniel was still here. The physicians around him were speaking, checking his vitals, scanning his neural activity. But their voices were distant, muffled. Kz'Rath's focus was on the echo in his thoughts. Run. That was the last thing Daniel had whispered before Kz'Rath was violently ripped back into reality. Run. From what? From him. From the humans? From something else. Your readings are unstable, Lervax was saying, scanning his cranial structure. His mandibles clicked with unease. Your neural pathways are still showing anomalies, unusual activity. Unusual. Kz'Rath almost laughed. No, this was far beyond unusual. This was impossible. The Vulek had studied countless species, read the minds of every major intelligence across the known galaxy. And never, never had they encountered something like this. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists. He needed to regain control. He needed to push whatever this was out of his mind before it consumed him. Then softly, inside his skull, Daniel chuckled. Kz'Rath stiffened. It wasn't an external sound. It wasn't something that came through his ears. It was inside him. A presence. A thought that did not belong. He slammed his hands against his temples, growling. Get out. Lervax flinched. Kz'Rath. He ignored him. His breathing was heavy, his pulse erratic. You don't belong here. He focused, pushed, tried to expel whatever fragment of Daniel was left in his mind. But the more he pushed, the deeper it rooted itself, like trying to dig a parasite out of his own brain. You still don't understand, do you? Kz'Rath's blood turned to ice. Daniel's voice. Not an illusion. Not a memory. It was him. Still here. A soft laugh. Calm. Controlled. You thought you were reading my mind. A pause. But I was reading yours. Kz'Rath's breath hitched. No. No, that's impossible. The human mind was chaotic, fragmented, unstructured. It had no discipline, no form, no method of controlled telepathy. Humans were not supposed to have this ability. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. Daniel had done something to him. He had turned the connection back on Kz'Rath. He had rid him. No, worse. He had left something behind. Kz'Rath's vision blurred. He wasn't in the medical bay anymore. He was somewhere else. Asterisk, asterisk flashes of memory. Asterisk, asterisk, not his own. A human battlefield. Explosions. The cries of the wounded. The stink of burning flesh. A city at night. Neon lights flickering over rain-slick streets. A woman standing on a balcony, staring at the stars. A deep, crushing loneliness. Then, suddenly, laughter. Not his. Daniel's. The vision snapped away. Kz'Rath gasped, his claws digging into the medical bed. He felt sick. Weak. Lurvax pressed a hand to his shoulder. Kz'Rath, your neural levels are unstable. You need to let us. Silence. The word came out in a snarl. Not entirely his own voice. The physician flinched, stepping back. Kz'Rath swallowed hard. His hands were still shaking. His mind was still not his own. He pushed his thoughts inward, focusing, trying to contain whatever this thing was. But Daniel wasn't fighting back. He wasn't attacking. He was watching, waiting, learning. Kz'Rath's stomach twisted. What had he done? What had he let in? He needed to act. Now, before this became something irreversible. He pushed himself off the bed, ignoring the protests of the physicians. His legs were weak, but he forced them to move. "Where are you going?" Lurvax asked. Kz'Rath didn't answer. His mind was racing. He needed to find a way to remove whatever was inside him. A neural purge, a psychic severance. Something, anything to break this link before it was too late. He had read thousands of minds before, but never had a mind read him back. And for the first time in his life, he was afraid. Not of Daniel, but of what he was becoming. The presence grows stronger. Kz'Rath moved through the halls of the research station, his vision flickering between reality and something else. His hands weren't entirely his own. His thoughts weren't entirely his own. And somewhere, deep in the back of his mind, Daniel was still smiling. "I am not me anymore." Kz'Rath staggered through the dim corridors of the research station, his claws scraping against the cold metal walls for balance. His mind felt fractured, like a vessel barely holding back an ocean of foreign thoughts. Daniel's presence was no longer a whisper. It was growing. Every step forward, Kz'Rath felt his own identity slip further away. The Vulek were supposed to be the apex of telepaths, the ones who read minds, shaped thoughts, controlled others. Yet here he was, his own mind unraveling, his own body betraying him. He reached the door to the neural purge chamber, a desperate solution, but his only hope. Inside, massive containment coils lined the room, humming with psionic energy. This chamber was designed for extreme cases, Vulek operatives who had absorbed too much neural residue from weak-minded species and needed a full psychic reset. But never had one been used like this. Never had a Vulek needed to purge a human. Kz'Rath didn't hesitate. He activated the controls, stepping into the chamber's core. The energy field buzzed to life around him, flickering with violet arcs of power. If this worked, it would erase all foreign influences, severing the human intrusion. If it failed, Kz'Rath clenched his jaw. He would not consider failure. He closed his eyes. Began the process. The coils flared, and suddenly, pain. Unimaginable, mind-searing pain. It felt like his very essence was being torn apart, pulled in all directions at once. Memories splintered, thoughts unraveled. The chamber was ripping through his consciousness, trying to separate him from it. For a moment, he felt relief. It was working. The presence, the human infection, was being burned away. And then, Daniel laughed. Inside his head. "Oh, Kz'Rath. No, 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 no." Kz'Rath's eyes snapped open. The chamber was still active, but something was wrong. The containment field flickered, the energy arcs twisting unnaturally. Daniel was still there. Not weakening. Growing. A horrifying realization clawed its way into Kz'Rath's mind. The purge wasn't working. Worse, Daniel was adapting to it. The containment coils strained. The energy surged wildly, no longer controlled. And then, just before the system overloaded, Daniel whispered, "Did you really think you could get rid of me?" The purge field collapsed. Kz'Rath was thrown backward, crashing against the chamber wall. His vision swam, the world twisting around him. The energy had backfired. He felt his neural pathways rewiring, reshaping. He wasn't alone in his own mind anymore. He would never be alone again. The truth revealed. Kz'Rath lay motionless on the floor, panting. His body trembled, every nerve in his form altered. No, changed. He wasn't just Kz'Rath anymore. Something else was inside him. Something human. His hands twitched, hands that no longer felt like his own. His breathing slowed. His thoughts were no longer purely Vulek. They were something new. And then, a final horror dawned upon him. Daniel wasn't a passenger. He was in control. Kz'Rath tried to fight, to push back, to scream. But his mouth moved on its own. And the voice that spoke, it was his, but also Daniel's. And it whispered, amused, satisfied. "I told you to run." A grin curled on Kz'Rath's lips, not his own. And deep inside, Kz'Rath realized. He was the passenger now. Epilogue. A mind forever change. Kz'Rath and the medical team arrived too late. The purge chamber was in ruins. Sparks flickered from overloaded circuits. Smoke filled the air. And there, standing calmly in the wreckage, was Kz'Rath, or at least, the thing that used to be him. He turned, eyes sharper than before. Darker. Something about him was off. "Are you all right?" Kz'Rath asked hesitantly. The figure tilted its head, smiled. "Yes," he said smoothly. "I see things, much clearer now." And for the first time in history, the Vulek had encountered something they could not control. Something that had taken control of them. A mind far more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined.